Search for a Method by Jean-Paul Sartre. Chapter 2, this is the first part. The problem of mediations and auxiliary disciplines. Why then are we not simply Marxists? It is because we take the statements of Engels and Garotti as guiding principles, as indications of jobs to be done, as problems, not as concrete truths. It is because their assertions seem to us insufficiently defined and, as such, capable of numerous interpretations. It is a word. It is because they appear to us as regulative ideas. The contemporary Marxist, on the contrary, finds them clear, precise, and unequivocal. For him, they already constitute a knowledge. We think, on the other hand, that everything remains to be done. We must find the method and constitute the science. Of course, Marxism allows us to situate a speech by Robespierre, the policy of the Montagnards, with regard to the sans-culotte, the economic regulations, and the laws concerning price ceilings voted by the Convention, as well as Valéry's poems or La Légende des siècles. But just what is this situating? If I turn to the works of contemporary Marxists, I see that they mean to determine for the object considered its real place in the total process. They will establish the material conditions of its existence, the class which has produced it, the interests of that class, or of a segment of that class, its movement, the forms of its struggle against the other classes, the relation of forces to each other, the stakes, etc. The speech, the vote, the political action, or the book will appear then in its objective reality as a certain moment in this conflict. It will be defined in terms of the factors on which it depends, and by the real action which it exerts. Thereby it will be made to enter, as an exemplary manifestation, into the universality of the ideology or of the policy, which are themselves considered as superstructures. Thus, the Girondists will be situated in reference to a bourgeoisie of merchants and shipowners who provoked war out of mercantile imperialism and who almost immediately wanted to stop it because it was injuring foreign trade. Marxists will, on the other hand, see in the Montagnards the representatives of a more recent bourgeoisie, enriched by buying up national properties and furnishing war materials, whose principal interest was consequently to prolong the conflict. Thus they will interpret the acts and discourses of Robespierre in terms of a fundamental economic contradiction. In order to continue the war, this petit bourgeois had to get his support from the people, but the fall of the assignat, monopoly, and the shortage of food supplies led the people to demand an economic control which was injurious to the interests of the Montagnards and repugnant to their liberal ideology. Behind this conflict, we discover the most profound contradiction between authoritarian parliamentarism and direct democracy. Or suppose we want to situate one of today's authors. Idealism is the nourishing soil of all bourgeois productions. It is an active force, since it reflects in its own way the profound contradictions of society. Each of its concepts is a weapon against the rising ideology. The weapon is offensive or defensive, according to circumstances, or better yet, offensive at the start. It subsequently becomes defensive. Thus, Lucas will distinguish between the false calm of the early pre-war period, which is expressed by a sort of permanent carnival of fetishized interiority, and the great penitence, the ebb tide of the post-war period, in which writers seek the third path to disguise their idealism. This method does not satisfy us. It is a priori. It does not derive its concepts from experience, or at least not from the new experiences which it seeks to interpret. It has already formed its concepts. It is already certain of their truth. It will assign to them the role of constitutive schemata. Its sole purpose is to force the events, the persons, or the acts considered into prefabricated molds. Consider Lucas. For him, Heidegger's existentialism is changed into an activism under the influence of the Nazis. French existentialism, which is liberal and anti-fascist, expresses, on the contrary, the revolt of the petit bourgeois who were enslaved during the occupation. What a beautiful fiction. Unfortunately, he overlooks two essential facts. First, there existed in Germany at least one existentialist movement which refused all collusion with Hitlerism, and which nevertheless survived until the Third Reich, that of Jaspers. Why did this undisciplined movement not conform to the schema imposed upon it? Could it have had, like Pavlov's dog, a freedom reflex? Second, there is one essential factor in philosophy: time. One needs a great deal of it to write a theoretical work. My book, Being and Nothingness, to which he refers directly, was the result of study begun in 1930. I read Husserl, Scheler, Heidegger, and Jaspers for the first time in 1933 during a year's residence at the French house in Berlin. It was at this very moment, when Heidegger should have been at the height of his activism, that I was subjected to the influence of these writers. Finally, by the winter of 1939-40, I had already worked out my method and my principal conclusions. And what is this activism if not a formal, empty concept, permitting one to liquidate all at once a certain number of ideological systems, which have only superficial resemblances to one another? Heidegger has never been an activist, at least not as he has expressed himself in his philosophical works. The very word, vague as it is, testifies to the total inability of the Marxist to comprehend any other thought. Yes, Lucas has the instruments to understand Heidegger, but he will not understand him. For Lucas would have to read him to grasp the meaning of the sentences one by one, and there is no longer any Marxist, to my knowledge, who is still capable of doing this. Finally, there has existed a whole dialectic, and a very complex one, from Brentano to Husserl, and from Husserl to Heidegger. Influences, oppositions, agreements, new oppositions, misunderstandings, distortions, denials, surpassings, etc. All this adds up to what one could call an area history. Ought we to consider it a pure epiphenomenon? According to what Lucas says, yes. Or does there exist some kind of movement of ideas? And does Husserl's phenomenology, as a moment preserved and surpassed, enter into Heidegger's system? In this case, the principles of Marxism are not changed, but the situation becomes much more complex. In the same way, the desire to effect as quickly as possible the reduction of the political to the social has sometimes falsified Guérin's analyses. One can, with some difficulty, grant with him that the Revolutionary War became, starting in 1789, a new episode in the commercial rivalry between the British and the French. The bellicosity of the Girondists was essentially political, and doubtless the Girondists expressed in their policy the class which had produced them and the interests of the milieu which supported them. Their disdainful ideal, their wish to submit the populace whom they despised to the enlightened elite of the bourgeoisie, that is, to confer upon the bourgeoisie the role of enlightened despot, their verbal radicalism and their practical opportunism, their sensibility, their carelessness, all this bears a trademark. But what is expressed in this way is the intoxication of an intellectual petite bourgeoisie in the process of taking over power, rather than the proud and already old-fashioned prudence of shipowners and merchants. When Brisset threw France into war in order to save the revolution and to unmask the treason of the king, this naive Machiavellianism expressed perfectly in its turn the Girondist attitude which we have just described. But if we put ourselves back in that period, and if we consider what occurred just prior to these events, the King's Flight, the massacre of the Republicans at the Champ de Mars, the shift to the right on the part of the moribund Constituent Assembly, and the revision of the Constitution, the uncertainty of the masses who were disgusted with the monarchy and intimidated by repression, the massive abstention on the part of the Parisian bourgeoisie, 10,000 voters as compared with 80,000 for the municipal elections. In a word, the breakdown of the revolution. And if we take into account also the Girondist ambitions, is there really any need to be in a hurry to cancel out political praxis? Must we recall the words of Brisset? We have need of great treasons. Must we insist on the precautions taken during the year 1792 to keep England out of war, which, according to Guérin, ought to be directed against her? Is it indispensable to consider this enterprise an insubstantial appearance, disguising the conflict of economic interests, when by itself it proclaims its meaning and its goal through contemporary speeches and writing? A historian, even a Marxist, cannot forget that the political reality for the men of 1792 is an absolute and irreducible. To be sure, they commit the error of ignoring the action of other forces, more muffled, less clearly discernible, infinitely more powerful. But that is exactly what defines these men as the bourgeois of 1792. Is this any reason to commit the opposite error and to refuse to grant a relative irreducibility to their action and to the political motives which it defines? There is no question here of determining, once and for all, the nature and the force of the resistance which the phenomena of superstructure oppose to all attempts at ruthless reduction. This would be to oppose one idealism to another. What is necessary is simply to reject a priorism. The unprejudiced examination of the historical object will be able by itself to determine in each case whether the action or the work reflects the superstructural motives of groups or of individuals formed by certain basic conditionings, or whether one can explain them only by referring immediately to economic contradictions and to conflicts of material interests. The American Civil War, despite the Puritan idealism of the Northerners, must be interpreted directly in economic terms. The people of that time were themselves aware of it. The French Revolution, on the other hand, although by 1793 it had assumed a very precise economic sense, is not directly reducible in 1792 to the age-old conflict of mercantile capitalisms. It must first be made to pass through a process of mediation, one which will bring into play the concrete men who were involved in it, the specific character it took on from its basic conditioning, the ideological instruments it employed, the real environment of the revolution. Above all, we must not forget that the political theory by itself had a social and economic meaning, since the bourgeoisie was struggling against the bonds of an ancient feudalism which from within prevented it from realizing its full development. In the same way, it is absurd to be too quick in reducing all ideological generosity to class interests. One ends up by proving that those anti-Marxists whom today we call Machiavellians are right. There is no doubt that, when the Legislative Assembly decided to undertake a war of liberation, it launched itself forward into a complex historical procedure or process, which would necessarily lead it to waging wars of conquest. But it would be a poor Machiavellian who would reduce the ideology of 1792 to the role of a simple cover-up for bourgeois imperialism. If we do not recognize its objective reality and its efficacy, we fall back into that form of idealism called economism, which Marx so often denounced. Why are we dissatisfied? Why do we react against Guérin's brilliant false demonstrations? Because Marxism ought to study real men in depth, not dissolve them in a bath of sulfuric acid. Now, the rapid schematic explanation of the war as an operation of the commercial bourgeoisie causes those men whom we know well to disappear. Brisset, Godet, Gensonet, Vergniaud, or else it constitutes them, in the final analysis, as the purely passive instruments of their class. But at the end of 1791, the upper bourgeoisie was in the process of losing control of the revolution. It recovered it only in 1794. The new men who were rising to power were petit bourgeois, more or less déclassés, poor, without too many connections, who had passionately bound up their own destiny with that of the revolution. To be sure, they were subjected to certain influences. They were caught up by high society, the best people of Paris, very different from the good society of Bordeaux. But they were never able in any way to express spontaneously the collective reaction of the Bordeaux ship owners and commercial imperialism. They favored the development of wealth, but the idea of risking the revolution in a war to assure a profit to certain circles of the grande bourgeoisie was completely alien to them. Moreover, Gray's theory leads us to this surprising conclusion. The bourgeoisie, which derives its profit from foreign trade, throws France into a war against the Emperor of Austria in order to destroy the power of England. At the same time, its delegates in power do everything to keep England out of the war. 1 year later, when war is finally declared against the British, this same bourgeoisie, discouraged at the moment of success, no longer has any desire for war at all. It is the bourgeoisie of the new landed proprietors, who have no interest in prolonging the conflict, which has to take over the war. Why this long discussion? To show, by the example of one of the best Marxist writers, that if one totalizes too quickly, if one transforms without evidence signification into intention, and result into an objective deliberately aimed at, then the real is lost. Also, that we must at all cost guard against replacing real, perfectly defined groups, like La Gironde, by insufficiently determined collectives, the bourgeoisie of importers and exporters. The Girondists existed. They pursued definite ends. They made history within a precise situation and on the basis of external conditions. They believed they were juggling with the revolution for their own advantage. In fact, they made it more radical and democratic. It is in terms of this political contradiction that they must be understood and explained. Of course, someone will tell us that the proclaimed goal of the followers of Brisset is a mask, that these bourgeois revolutionaries considered themselves and presented themselves as illustrious Romans, that it is the objective result which really defines what they did. But we must be careful. The original thought of Marx, as we find it in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, attempts a difficult synthesis of intention and of result. The contemporary use of that thought is superficial and dishonest. If we push the Marxist metaphor to its limit, in fact, we arrive at a new idea of human action. Imagine an actor who is playing Hamlet and who is caught up in his role. He crosses his mother's room to kill Polonius hidden behind the arras. But that is not what he is actually doing. He crosses a stage before an audience and passes from courtside to gardenside in order to earn his living, to win fame, and this real activity defines his position in society. But one cannot deny that these real results are present in some way in his imaginary act. One cannot deny that the movement of the imaginary prince expresses in a certain indirect and refracted manner the actor's real movement, nor that the very way in which he takes himself for Hamlet is his own way of knowing himself an actor. To return to our Romans of 1789, their way of calling themselves Cato is their way of making themselves bourgeois, members of a class which discovers history and which already wants to stop it, which claims to be universal and which establishes the proud individualism of its members upon a competitive economy, In short, the heirs of a classical culture. Everything is there. It is one and the same thing to declare oneself Roman and to want to stop the revolution. Or rather, the better one can pose as Brutus or Cato. The better one will be able to stop the revolution. This thought, obscure even to itself, sets up mystical ends which enclose the confused awareness of its objective ends. Thus we may speak simultaneously of a subjective drama, the simple play of appearances which hides nothing, which contains no unconscious element, and of an objective, intentional organization of real means with a view to achieving real ends, without any organization of all this by a consciousness or a premeditated will. Very simply, the truth of the imaginary praxis is in the real praxis. And the real, to the extent that it takes itself as merely imaginary, includes implicit references to the imaginary praxis as to its interpretation. The bourgeois of 1789 does not pretend to be Cato in order to stop the revolution by denying history and by substituting virtue for politics. Neither does he tell himself that he resembles Brutus in order to give himself a mythical comprehension of an action which he carries out, but which escapes him. He does both at the same time, and it is precisely this synthesis which allows us to discover an imaginary action in each one as a doublet, and at the same time the matrix of real objective action. But if that is what is meant, then the followers of Brisset, at the very core of their ignorance, must be the responsible authors of the economic war. This external, stratified responsibility must have been internalized as a certain obscure awareness of their political drama. In short, it is men whom we judge and not physical forces. Now, in the name of that intransigent but strictly just conception, which regulates the relation of subjective to objectification, a view with which I, for my part, am in complete agreement, we must acquit the Gironde on this count of the indictment. Its dramas and its inward dreams do not refer to the future Anglo-French conflict any more than does the objective organization of its acts. But very often today people reduce this difficult idea to a wretched truism. They willingly admit that Brisset did not know what he was doing, but they insist on the obvious fact that sooner or later the social and political structure of Europe had to become involved in a general war. Therefore, by declaring war on the princes and on the emperor, the Legislative Assembly declared it on the King of England. That is what it was doing without knowing it. Now, this conception is by no means specifically Marxist. It limits itself to restating what everybody has always known. The consequences of our acts always end up by escaping us, since every concerted enterprise, as soon as it is realized, enters into relation with the entire universe, and since this infinite multiplicity of relation goes beyond our intention. If we look at things from this angle, human action is reduced to that of a physical force, whose effect evidently depends upon the system in which it is exercised. But for this very reason, one can no longer speak of doing. It is men who do, not avalanches. The bad faith of our Marxists consists in bringing two concepts into play at the same time so as to preserve the benefit of a teleological interpretation, while concealing the abundant, high-handed use which they make of the explanation by finality. They employ the second concept to make it appear to everyone that there is a mechanistic interpretation of history. Ends have disappeared. At the same time, they make use of the first so as surreptitiously to transform into real objectives of a human activity the necessary but unforeseeable consequences which this activity entails. Hence, that tedious vacillation in Marxist explanations. From one sentence to another, the historical enterprise is defined implicitly by goals, which often are only unforeseen results, or reduced to the diffusion of a physical movement across an inert milieu. A contradiction? No, bad faith. One must not confuse the scintillation of ideas with dialectic. Marxist formalism is a project of elimination. The method is identical with terror in its inflexible refusal to differentiate. Its goal is total assimilation at the least possible effort. The aim is not to integrate what is different as such, while preserving for it a relative autonomy, but rather to suppress it. Thus, the perpetual movement toward identification reflects the bureaucrat's practice of unifying everything. Specific determinations awaken in the theory the same suspicions as persons do in reality. For the majority of Marxists, to think is to claim to totalize, and under this pretext to replace particularity by a universal. It is to claim to lead us back to the concrete and thereby present us with fundamental but abstract determinations. Hegel at least allowed the particular to continue to exist as a surpassed particularity. The Marxist would believe that he was wasting his time if, for example, he tried to understand the originality of a bourgeois thought. In his eyes, the only thing which matters is to show that the thought is a mode of idealism. Naturally, he will recognize that a book written in 1956 does not resemble a book of 1930. This is because the world has changed, and ideology too, which reflects the world from the point of view of a particular class. The bourgeoisie enters into a period of withdrawal. Idealism will then assume another form so as to express this new position, this new tactic. But for the intellectual Marxists, this dialectical movement does not leave the plane of universality. The problem is to define it in its generality and to show that in the work considered, it is expressed in the same way as in all others which appeared at the same date. The Marxist, therefore, is impelled to take as an appearance the real content of behavior or of a thought. When he dissolves the particular in the universal, he has the satisfaction of believing that he is reducing appearance to truth. Actually, by defining his subjective concept of reality, he has only defined himself. Marx was so far from this false universality that he attempted to generate his knowledge dialectically in man, rising progressively from the broadest determinations to the most precise. In a letter to LaSalle, he defines his method as a pursuit which rises from the abstract to the concrete, and for him the concrete is the hierarchical totalization of determinations and of hierarchized realities. For the population is an abstraction if I omit, for example, the classes from which it is formed. These classes in turn are a word empty of meaning if I ignore the factors on which they are based. For example, work for wages, capital, etc. But inversely, these fundamental determinations would remain abstract if we were to sever them from the realities which support them and which they modify. The population of England in the middle of the 19th century is an abstract universal, a chaotic representation of the aggregate, so long as it is considered as a simple quantity. But the economic categories are themselves insufficiently determined if we do not first establish that they are applied to the English population. That is, to real men who live and make history in the capitalist country whose industrialization is most advanced. It is in the name of this totalization that Marx will be able to show the action of superstructures on substructural facts. But if it is true that the population is an abstract concept, so long as we have not defined it by its most fundamental structures, that is, so long as it has not taken its place as a concept within the framework of the Marxist interpretation, it is also true that when this framework exists, and for the intellectual who is experienced in the dialectical method, men, their objectifications and their labors, human relations, are finally what is the most concrete. A first approximation painlessly puts them at their proper level and discovers their general determinations. Where we already know the direction and character of a society, the development of its productive forces and its relations of production, there every new fact, a man, an action, a work, appears as already situated in its generality. progress consists in clarifying the more profound structures by means of the originality of the established fact in order to be able, in turn, to determine this originality by the fundamental structures. There's a double movement, but today's Marxists behave as if Marxism did not... Page isn't turning. Oh, shit. Sorry. Did not exist. But today's Marxists behave as if Marxism did not exist, and as if each one of them in every intellectual act reinvented it, finding it each time exactly equal to itself. They behave as if the man or the group or the book appeared to them in the form of a chaotic representation of the aggregate, although they know very well that a particular book is by a certain bourgeois author in a certain bourgeois society at a certain moment of its development, and that all these qualities have been already established by other Marxists. All this takes place for these theoreticians, as if it were absolutely necessary to reduce this so-called abstraction. The political conduct of a particular individual or his literary work to a truly concrete reality, capitalist imperialism, idealism, which in fact is only in itself an abstract determination. Thus, the concrete reality of a philosophical work will be idealism. The work represents only a transient mode of it. In itself, it is characterized only by deficiency and nothingness. What makes its being is its permanent reducibility to substance, idealism, thus a perpetual process of fetishizing.